This conference will now be recorded.
Well, welcome UT students. And first, we're going to go over the human brain anatomy. This will be our introduction before we get into the neonatal neurosonography scanning. And I am your Executive Program Director, Claudia Vass. Now, our objectives for doing this review is, of course, before we start learning how to scan a baby's brain, we want to go over the parts that we need to be familiar with. And these parts also are needed when doing obstetric ultrasounds. And we are setting the foundation for doing lumbar spine sonography. I thought this was a pretty picture of the brain. So let's just first go over the divisions of the brain. There's the cerebrum, the diencephalon, which consists of the thalamus and the hypothalamus, the brainstem, which consists of the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. Now, these regions do different things. There are the motor areas, sensory areas, our senses, touch, smell, taste, and then there's higher functions like thinking. Now, major anatomical regions of the brain, here we go. Here's the cerebrum, which is that outer part, the diencephalon, which consists of the thalamus and the hypothalamus, which are very important. Well, they all are important, but it's important for you, all of you, to internalize the brainstem and the cerebellum. Now, the brain must be protected, of course. The brain is so important, it's protected by the skull. Then it has the cerebral spinal fluid, which cushions it, and then the meninges, which are membranes that surround the brain and only allow certain substances to cross through to the brain. The brain is one of the few organs that can only use glucose to get ATP as its energy source. I don't know if you guys remember, but what organ takes the most glucose from our body? It is the brain. Without sugar in our bloodstream, the brain will die. And that's why proper nutrition is so important. As we all know, when you don't eat, what happens? You can't think. Your brain needs that constant energy. Brain size matters. Geniuses have the same size brain as everyone else. They are just more efficient at forming synapses. They also have more synapses because they have more dendrites. You can develop more dendrites and synapses by keeping your brain active by learning and reading new things. And that's what all of you have been doing in this program. I think we've gained, all of us gained a large amount of synapses and dendrites. Fun fact, scientists say the higher your IQ, the more you dream. How often do you dream? That's something to think about. And here I thought this was kind of cute. We really do use 100% of our brains, and I don't think we're doomed. Now, the cerebrum. The brain is divided into parts and is bilaterally symmetrical. In general, the left side controls the right half of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left half of the body. The largest portion of the brain is the cerebrum. It makes up 80% of the brain. The cerebrum controls our logical thought and conscious awareness of the environment and the sensory and motor activity. The cerebrum is made up mostly of the gray matter, which it consists of cell bodies, dendrites, and unmyelinated axons. The cerebrum is divided into two halves called the cerebral hemispheres, and they are separated by a fissure, which is called the longitudinal fissure. Each hemisphere is divided into lobes, named for the bones that are on top of them. So that makes it easy. And here we go. You see that long fissure, the longitudinal fissure. This is important to know and memorize. You've got your frontal lobe, your parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, and the cerebellum down there in the posterior portion. Gyrus and sulcus. So what does that mean? They are the superficial region of the brain, and all other organs is called the cortex. The surface is not smooth, it's convoluted. Each bump on the surface of the cerebrum is called a gyrus, and each shallow groove on the surface of the cerebrum is called a sulcus. So one's the mountain and the other one's the valley. So the peaks and the valleys. This up and down formation increases the surface area, and the surface cortex is where the information processing happens. So if you think about it, if you're trying to get a large piece of fabric into a small area, it's going to have a bunch of wrinkles in it. And that's kind of the same concept. The mountains are the gyrus and the sulcus are the valleys. And here's a diagram showing that. We have many gyrus with their own names: central sulcus, pre-central gyrus, post-central gyrus. Primarily it has to do where it is. And you see down there on the bottom, the gyrus and the sulcus. And fissures, as you can see, let's take a look at that one down on the bottom. You see that the sulcus goes down partially, but the fissure goes deep. So fissures are deep, sulcus are more superficial. And here we go. Here's another picture just to go over the facts so that you can remember it. The fissure is deep, the sulcus is superficial. Now, the frontal lobe and parietal lobes are separated by the central sulcus. The temporal lobe is between the parietal and frontal lobe, separated by the lateral sulcus. Remember, your temples are lateral. The occipital lobe does not have a real border, it's just a region. These are the anatomical areas, but the functional areas are more important when we talk about the brain. As far as imaging goes, it is important for you to know where these areas are and what they are called. And here we go. The lateral sulcus is lateral, central sulcus is on top. Now this is really important, the corpus callosum. If you slice the brain down the center in a mid-sagittal section, you will slice through a white-colored tissue called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the area that connects the right and left halves of the brain. The fact that it is white means that it is made up of myelinated axons. So think about it. There is a syndrome called split brain syndrome, and these are for people who were born with the corpus callosum not connecting. So again, we had said you've got the right side of your brain and the left side of the brain. Left controls the right side of your body, right controls the left side of your body. And the reason that we can do both is because we have the corpus callosum. In split brain syndrome, there was a case study with a woman who had split brain syndrome where when she would get up in the morning to find her, get clothes out of the closet, her right hand would grab a dress and then the left hand would grab an outfit, and both wanted to have their own way because they could not come to a decision because she did not have the crossing of the corpus callosum. You guys can Google it. It's called split brain syndrome. So the right and the left are completely different personalities, which is interesting because if you think about what makes up your personality, you've got a right side and a left side, and they come together with the corpus callosum. But what if they can't come together? What kind of personality are you? That's a thinker. And there it is, the corpus callosum. Very important to know, especially for the boards in neurosonography. There's the picture. Do you see that it is white? Now, this is not a human brain. This is a sheep's brain, but they have a corpus callosum too, and theirs is white also. The corpus callosum is the area that is responsible for the right half of the brain communicating with the left, just like I said. If the corpus callosum were cut, there would be no communication between the right and the left. Autism is a neurological disease that includes problems with communication between the right and the left cerebral hemispheres. Now we're going to go on to the diencephalon. It consists of two parts, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is the superior portion of the diencephalon. It processes sensory information according to its importance. It's a major relay station for sensory impulses to the cerebrum. The hypothalamus is the inferior portion of the diencephalon. It makes hormones which maintains the homeostasis of the body, which makes sure that everything is metabolizing correctly, I'm sorry. So there you see them deep down you see the hypothalamus. Let me get out my arrow right there, and the thalamus. The thalamus functions to sort out all the sensory information. So think of it as a crossing guard. As this information comes through, it tells it where to go. It compares the input and determines what information is worth sending to the cortex. Your body ignores most sensory information. Up until now, have you noticed the sound of the air conditioner on? Or, in today's case, maybe the heater. It's not important, so it goes unnoticed. This area also compares information from the right and left eyes for stereoscopic vision, and the right and the left ear to determine direction of sound. Now you have your hypothalamus underneath it. This small area exerts more control over our autonomic functioning than any other part. It makes hormones which provide that homeostatic control over the body. Maintaining homeostasis by controlling the autonomic nervous reflexes, glucose, and hormone levels. It is also the main visceral organ control center. So it controls body temperature, hunger and thirst, blood pressure by using hormones. Functionally, the hypothalamus is part of the limbic system, which that involves memories and emotions. So that's why a painful memory can increase blood pressure and a good memory can lower blood pressure. And interesting enough, I have read that veterans coming back or people who have suffered severe PTSD, they're looking at medications that will do something to the hypothalamus so they will be able to control these extreme emotions coming from bad memories. Again, same picture showing you where it is. And I highly suggest for all of you to memorize every single part of the brain. Basal ganglia. It's a group of structures deep in the cerebral hemispheres. In the cerebrum, it is the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. In the midbrain, it is the substantia nigra. And in the diencephalon, it's a subthalamic nucleus. Each part has its own role, but together they're responsible for movement of the body. And that's the area where they all are. The caudate nucleus, it's part of this basal ganglia. It's C-shaped structure. It snuggles against the lateral ventricles. It has a head, body, and a tail. And it's observed to play a role in repetitive behavior, like OCD. So here we go. Here is the caudate nucleus. You can see that it's C-shaped. It has a tail over here. This is the putamen. It's up by the head. Here's your thalamus. And then, of course, the globus pallidus we cannot see. Now let's go into the brainstem. The brainstem consists of the midbrain, which is here, pons, and the medulla oblongata. And you see it right over here. They are anterior to the cerebellum. And they're posterior. They're leading to the spinal cord. Midbrain. The top of the brainstem is the midbrain. It controls automatic behaviors like fight or flight. The midbrain also contains a pigmented area called the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra is involved in addictions and in initiating body movement. The substantia nigra secretes the neurotransmitter dopamine. When the neurons in the substantia nigra becomes damaged, dopamine levels decrease, causing Parkinson's disease. Treatment is to replace dopamine. We see how anything abnormal that happens to any one of these brains, there will be a result. And when we are looking at the brand new baby's brains, we are concerned with each part because this will tell us what the potential, what's going to happen with this baby's future. What is dopamine? Several important diseases of the nervous system are associated with dysfunctions of dopamine system. Parkinson's disease, an age-related degenerative condition causing tremor and motor impairment, is caused by a loss of dopamine, secreting neurons in the substantia nigra. Schizophrenia has been shown to involve elevated levels of dopamine activity in regions of the brain and decreased levels of dopamine in other regions. So the chemistry in the brain is abnormal, and it causes this behavior, which is sad for someone. And that's why they use the medications to help ease these symptoms. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, is also believed to be associated with decreased levels of dopamine. So I wanted you guys to see how important dopamine is. Now we're on to pons, which is right over here. Farther down the brainstem is the pons after the midbrain, which relays sensory information between the cerebellum for balance and the cerebrum, conscious awareness. Then below that is the medulla oblongata. At the base of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata, which contains the cardiac, respiratory, vomiting, and vasomotor, which means like blood vessel constriction centers. It controls the nerves that affect the heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing. Damage here causes a coma. So many accident victims who are in a coma, it is usually due to an extreme injury to the medulla oblongata. Swelling from an injury causes pressure, which can damage this area. And concussions, as you all know about, concussions can be anywhere, cause nausea and a decrease in blood pressure. And patients with these symptoms need an MRI to see if the early signs of damage to the medulla oblongata. It's very crucial to know if anything in that area had been damaged. Okay, so let's see if this will work right. What's the difference between the medulla oblongata, the function of the medulla oblongata and the hypothalamus? Well, the medulla oblongata controls blood pressure directly using the nerves, and the hypothalamus controls it indirectly using hormones. Now, the cerebellum, down there at the bottom, the cerebellum is the second largest portion of the brain. It's responsible for balance and muscle coordination and is a comparator, which we'll get into. Very important to see the cerebellum when we're doing obstetric ultrasounds also, because it can tell us a lot of what's going on with this baby's development. The cerebellum functions as a comparator. Action potentials from the cerebral motor cortex descend into the spinal cord to move the muscles. There are branches that are sent to the cerebellum to give it information on the intended movement. At the same time, the cerebellum receives information from prior reception neurons. Sensory, they tell what position each body part is in. The cerebellum compares all this information to allow smooth movement, coordination. That is why we call it a comparator. It helps us to coordinate. And this shows when you're not coordinated. Now, the cistern magnum is also important to be aware of, especially with obstetric ultrasounds. It is also called the cerebellomedullaris cistern. It's one of three of the subarachnoid cisterns. It's between the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata. Cerebral spinal fluid produced in the fourth ventricle drain into the cistern. Again, this is a very important area, and I'm going to, if you guys can see me with the arrow, to see in obstetrics, and of course you want to see it with neonatal scanning. Cortex and associated areas. Each area of the sensory region of the brain has a place where the sensory information comes in and another area where the information is understood. So we're getting information in and then we process it. The area where the information comes in is the cortex. An area where it is understood is the association area. Therefore, there will be a visual cortex and an association area. Auditory cortex and its association area. Somatic, which means touch, cortex and its association area, and a gustatory cortex, which is taste, and its association area. There is also a motor cortex and association areas. Why is this important? Because if some area is damaged, we can predict what the issues are that this person is going to have. And here's a diagram showing you all these different areas and what their turf is when it comes to a human being. So the sensory areas. The somatosensory areas, their primary somatosensory cortex, it has an association area. The primary somatosensory cortex receives signals for touch and pressure. The somatosensory association area interprets the sensation. So when I put my hand in my pocket, I know that it is my keys I am feeling. How do I know that? Well, I'm touching it. That information goes up to that association area, and I understand because I know the feeling of my keys. We have visual areas. So the primary visual cortex, which is in the back, it gives us the visual association. The primary visual cortex receives signals from the optic nerve. The visual association area interprets the signal. When I look at my keys, I can identify them as keys. And then there's the auditory area. The primary auditory area receives signals from the ear. The auditory association area interprets the signals. When I hear a sound, I can tell you what it is that I'm hearing, and I can also predict where it's coming from. Interesting that when a person is dying, they say this is the last area that shuts down. So people can hear you. The auditory area is where language is formed. Language is natural to humans. These are just fun facts. A group of deaf children in South America were found to have created their own language using nouns, verbs, pronouns, and adjectives, even though no one there knew any sign language to teach them. So that's really interesting because of this area that they can't hear, yet they were able to create a language. And then there are certain strokes that cause injury to this area, and the person can't use adjectives, but everything else is normal. So our language comes from this auditory area, but you don't have to hear to be able to create a language. Now, there is another part of the brain which is deep down, and it is the insula. It is the insular lobe, which is underneath, and that isn't something that you just need to know for anatomy. Motor areas. There are the primary motor cortex, which you see up here, and its motor association area. So here is the different association areas. The primary motor cortex contains upper motor neurons, which extend down the spinal cord and synapse on lower motor neurons, which then leave the spinal cord to innervate every muscle and gland. A motor unit is a neuron and all of the muscle fibers it connects to. Some muscles have more motor units than others, like hands and eyes. Now, here we go. This is down into the spinal cord, and we see the interneuron as it comes out and the receptive ending. This is important too. That sets up the stage for when we get into the lumbar spine. Motor association neurons, planning movement. This is when you plan to reach for a new item. You have not rehearsed it, but you know to extend your forearms to lift something. So if you were going to pick up the book from your desk, you have actually set off all this electricity so that your hand will reach over to the book, put your fingers around it, and lift it. A signal is sent to the primary motor cortex to turn on specific motor units to do that. Damage from a stroke equals losing function to that area, but you can compensate by using other muscles and relearn that movement. Primary motor association, learned motor skills. These are pre-programmed skills, like when you know how to type, swing, or scan. I don't know if you guys remember when I did my interview process, I told you you were going to learn brand new hand-eye skills, which are motor skills. When someone asks you how to spell a word, but you can't do it until you write it out, it's because that memory is now a motor skill. The same happens when you know how to tie your own shoelace or necktie, but can't easily teach someone else how to do it. It is initially learned by repetition. These are the fascinating things about the brain, and this is why I want us all to take this very seriously when we're looking at neonatal brains and also in obstetrics. And these were just little games, and I'm sure you've done them in class. Use your right foot to draw a clockwise circle in the air. While keeping your foot going, draw the number 6 in the air with your hand. Did your foot start moving counterclockwise? That's because you haven't taught it yet. And again, this is just some fun stuff to see how your brain works. Now, the hippocampus, that has to do with memory. We talked about motor memory. You can also have memory of events. This is controlled by the hippocampus, which means seahorse because it's shaped like one. The hippocampus plays a major role in storing and retrieving memories. But memories are not stored only there or in any other single site in the brain. They are stored throughout the brain, especially in the cerebral cortex. And right here is your hippocampus. And in front of it is called the amygdala. And again, we have the hippocampus right here, and then the amygdala on top. Amygdala, what is that? Well, it functions to take new memories and allow them to be stored, making them long-term memories. One man who had severe epilepsy had his amygdala removed. His seizures stopped, but he developed antegrade amnesia and could no longer remember anything new. The amygdala is like a bouncer at a nightclub. It determines what information is important enough to go into long-term storage by allowing it to go through the hippocampus. The memories that carry emotional weight are allowed in. These are memories that shape our identity. And I don't know if any of you have had to deal with a relative or loved one who has suffered from Alzheimer's. You will see that their short-term memory slowly decreases, but their long-term memory stays there. Now the fornix. The fornix carries signals from mammillary bodies to the rest of the hippocampus. Fornix means arch. A pair of small round bodies at the anterior end of the fornix. Part of the diencephalon, they form part of the limbic system, which has to do with emotions and memories. They relay information, recognition memory from the hippocampus. They also add the element of smell to memories. And here is the fornix, right here. And smell to memory. So if you smell pumpkin pie, what does that make you think of? Or certain smells can make a memory come up, good or bad, that had happened to you, whether it's cookies or some kind of stench. It's all there coming from your fornix. And again, here's the body of the fornix. Here's the hippocampus. And then these are the anterior pillars of the fornix. Now here we go. So here's the corpus callosum. Remember that white structure? And then here is the fornix. And then here is the amygdala. And then right here is the hippocampus. Fun facts about the brains. I think that this is kind of cool. Bees tell other members of the hive where food is by doing a special dance that relays distance and direction. If you think about it, these little bees can tell each other how far to go and in which direction. Octopus have the ability to sort out complex problems on their own. Another interesting thing about an octopus is that their arms are made up of material that's actually the same as what our brains are made up of. So the 8 arms are like 8 separate brains. A dolphin doesn't need to see to catch a meal. It sends out sound waves which bounce back and create a 3D ultrasound image of it. So they've got their own transducer coming out of their own heads. Dolphins are one of the most intelligent mammals. They've learned to sleep using only half their brains. While one half rests, the other remains alert and continues the respiratory process. Because remember, dolphins need to come up for air. And the brain of a roach is located in its body, and if by accident it should lose its head, it can live up to 9 days completely decapitated. It dies from starvation because it can't eat. So moving on, the meninges. These are tissues that cover the entire central nervous system. There are 3 layers that serve to protect and cushion the brain. These 3 layers, the dura mater is the thickest and most superficial of the meninges. There is the arachnoid mater is the middle layer and is not nearly as dense. It also does not go all the way down into the sulci. It only covers over the top of the gyrus. The pia mater is the thin, shiny layer that does follow the brain surface into the sulci. Subdural space is between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. It has the blue venous blood. The subarachnoid space is between the arachnoid and pia mater and is filled with the cerebral spinal fluid. Dura mater, what does that mean? It means tough mother. Dense, regular connective tissue like a tendon or ligament. It has 2 layers. Under the skull is the first layer of the dura mater, called the periosteal layer. Periosteal means by the bone. Just under this is the second layer called the meningeal layer. There are 2 layers everywhere except around the spinal cord where it's just 1 layer. The meningeal layer of the dura mater, which has no periosteal layer. Between the meningeal and the periosteal layers of the dura mater are the dural sinuses, which are filled with venous blood and which is drained from the brain. A lot going on. So here we go, the dural sinus and the subarachnoid space. So there we see, we're pointing to these sinuses, which we have drainage from the veins. Here are the layers. So here's the scalp, the periosteum. This is our skull. This is your dura mater. The dura mater, which is the tough mother, consists of the periosteal and the meningeal. And then under here is the arachnoid mater. Now, arachnoid comes from Greek, a spider. So it has the spidery because of all these vessels. And then you see the blood vessels going through. And then this is the longitudinal fissure of the brain. Here we go with the superior sinus, the subdural space, and the subarachnoid space. And you see how it's got these tiny little legs. Excuse me. Clinical significance. The dura and arachnoid mater both have lots of blood vessels, which might rupture in any injury around the brain, called the subdural or subarachnoid hemorrhage, which is potentially fatal. Blood accumulates and squeezes the brain. When the blood clots, it is called a hematoma. And the treatment is to drill a hole, preferably before it clots. And I don't know if you guys have been reading about what's going on with football players, but they get tiny little ones in there. In the spinal cord between L3 and L4, a doctor can inject anesthesia above the dura mater. So only the nerves that are affected to help childbirth. And what is this called? The epidural, because it is on top of the dura mater. Now, ventricles of the brain, very important for you, all of you to memorize. This is important for obstetrics, important for neonatal. The brain contains these hollow spaces called ventricles, and they're filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and they are extensive, and the names are very simple. The lateral ventricle is the largest. It extends throughout the cerebrum. It is between the corpus callosum and the fornix. So both of those are nestled up against those ventricles. The third ventricle looks like a cavity between the fornix and a red arch. Fourth ventricle is at the base of the cerebellum. It is continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord and also with the subarachnoid space. The cerebral aqueduct, which connects the third and the fourth ventricle. The used cerebral spinal fluid drains out of the brain at the aqueduct and returns to the blood circulation. The ventricles, subarachnoid space, and cerebral aqueduct are filled with cerebral spinal fluid. The subdural space is not filled with cerebral spinal fluid. It is filled with venous blood. So here we go. Here are the lateral ventricles, and it has what's called an anterior horn. And then here is the inferior horn. They connect, because remember, there's fluid that's flowing around here. So here is the third ventricle, also the fourth ventricle right here. So let's look over here. So here's the anterior horn, your lateral ventricle, right there draining the third ventricle, draining through the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle. Cerebral spinal fluid is similar to plasma because it is derived from plasma. CSF is made in the ventricles by a group of capillaries called the choroid plexus. Very important to know this, especially with obstetric scanning, because you will be looking at the choroid plexus, and also with neonatal scanning. The choroid plexus capillaries have holes that allow the blood plasma to leak into the subarachnoid space, and then it is now called cerebral spinal fluid. So, function of the fluid-filled ventricles, they allow the brain to float. The brain has cerebral spinal fluid on the outside as well. The brain is the consistency of jello and weighs about 3 pounds. Its weight could crush the spinal cord if it didn't float. The ventricles allow cushion. In sudden movement, like riding a bike into a tree and hitting your head on the tree, the brain hits inside the skull in the back and then it recoils to the front. So it's moving around in there, but it gives it enough cushion so that you might feel a little funny afterwards, but you'll recover. It also acts as the lymphatic system of the brain because the brain doesn't have a lymphatic system. Now, when there are problems with meninges, and we're just touching on this, we'll get into this more in obstetrics and with neonatal, hydrocephaly. It is an accumulation of cerebral spinal fluid inside these ventricles. It is usually congenital and it's caused by a blockage of the cerebral aqueduct. Remember, we showed it leading to the fourth ventricle. The cerebral spinal fluid is made but can't leave, and the brain just expands. Now, the skull bones in a newborn can expand, so although it can damage the brain, it does not always cause mental retardation if it is treated early enough. The head just becomes enlarged, it kind of goes with it. Treatment is to put a tube in to drain it. Hydrocephaly in adults can be caused by a tumor, and since the skull no longer expands, then it's very dangerous. And here are these sweet babies that have hydrocephalus, and they treat it to try to drain that fluid out so that when the baby grows, they'll grow into their skull. And this is just showing you what medicine is able to do to help cure this. Some people have to have it done continuously. So conclusion, this will prepare you for learning about the brain and neonatal ultrasound. Also prepare you for the OB. We have set a foundation for the lumbar spine. And I just put the brain is important, period. And I actually personally find it to be fascinating. So thank you. And I will create another PowerPoint or my own PowerPoint for the neonatal scanning. Thank you.